Why you feel empty, even when life looks full. A Buddhist truth few understand. There is a kind of silence that doesn't happen when the house grows quiet, but when something deep within you does. It's not the silence of loneliness or sadness, but something more subtle, more persistent. A stillness that arrives not with thunder but like mist, barely noticeable at first, until you realize it's everywhere. You wake up, make your tea, move through your morning. The sky is the same, the coffee tastes the same, the clock still ticks its slow rhythm on the wall. But something inside of you no longer moves, no longer sings. You're present but not quite alive, awake but only halfway here. Grace is 67. She lives alone now in a house that once echoed with voices, footsteps, laughter. She has a pension, a bookshelf lined with family memories, a garden she still tends on good days. And yet some evenings, she sits in her living room and feels like a stranger in her own story. Not because she is grieving, not because something terrible has happened, but because something vital has quietly slipped away. "I don't feel broken," she told a friend once. "I just don't feel." And maybe you felt that too. Maybe you've noticed it in the way your days blur together, in how hard it is to remember the last time you felt deeply moved by anything at all. It's not that your life is bad. You're not suffering in any dramatic way, but beneath it all there's this soft emptiness, a space inside that nothing seems to reach. If that sounds familiar, stay with me. Because this video is not just another explanation for how to fix your life or make you more productive or happy. This is something quieter, something older. This is an invitation to explore what the Buddha meant when he spoke of no self, a teaching often misunderstood, but one that may hold the key to understanding this very feeling you carry. Because what if the emptiness you feel isn't a problem to be solved, but a message to be heard? What if this silence inside you is not evidence that something is missing, but that something deeper is ready to emerge? In the next few minutes, we'll walk together through stories, through stillness, through the ancient wisdom of those who saw clearly what most of us only sense. You'll hear about others who have stood where you're standing now, not lost, but paused. Not broken, but unfolding. This is not just a video to watch and forget. It's one to stay with, because within it are reflections and reminders that might change the way you see not just your pain, but your very self. So breathe. Be here, be gentle with whatever rises. And as we begin, I ask you to do just one thing: stay. Let your heart stay open just a little longer than usual, because you might discover that you were never truly empty, only spacious. And in that space, something true is waiting. Chapter 1: The Hunger That Never Fills. There is a kind of hunger that doesn't make noise, doesn't gnaw at the stomach or demand attention through sharp pain. It's the kind that quietly settles into the background of everyday life, arriving between the small tasks, behind the smiles, beneath the normalcy. It doesn't interrupt you, it waits. You may notice it when the day winds down and silence enters the room, or when you're surrounded by people but still feel strangely alone, like you're watching life through glass. It's not loneliness exactly. It's not sadness either. It's something subtler, something older. It's the quiet ache that maybe, just maybe, you no longer know what you're really doing here. And when this feeling arises, it often confuses us. Because from the outside, everything seems fine. You've done what society asked of you. You've raised the children, paid your bills, stayed loyal to your family, sacrificed your own dreams for the sake of others. And now that the noise has stopped, now that the house is quiet and no one needs you every second, you expect relief. But what you get instead is emptiness. Grace is 70 years old. Her home sits quietly at the edge of a forest. The kind of house where morning light filters through lace curtains and the sound of birds is the loudest thing at dawn. She has everything she thought she wanted: a garden, a pension, old photo albums lined up on the shelf like trophies of a life well lived. And yet, some evenings she finds herself sitting in the living room, staring at the steam rising from her tea, and she wonders when she stopped feeling anything at all. Not because something terrible happened, not because she's grieving or depressed, but because somewhere along the way, the part of her that used to feel alive, the part that sang silently within, has fallen silent. "I don't feel broken," she once told a friend. "I just don't feel." And perhaps you know that feeling too. That quiet disconnection, that hunger that nothing seems to satisfy. In Buddhism, this is not seen as a flaw. This is not a sign of failure. This is the beginning of insight. Because the Buddha taught that suffering often hides not in loud pain, but in subtle confusion, the kind that keeps us searching for something, even when we don't know what it is. He called this kind of suffering dukkha, not just suffering as we usually define it, but the fundamental dissatisfaction that runs beneath all human experience when we forget who we are. And when we try to fill this inner hunger by grasping for identity, roles, labels, achievements, we only deepen the illusion. The Buddha's own life began with this realization. Born into royalty, he had every comfort the world could offer. Yet even amidst wealth and pleasure, he sensed a strange hollowness, a quiet knowing that none of it could offer lasting peace. So he left it all behind, not because the world was evil, but because he wanted to understand why, even when everything seemed perfect, something still felt missing. And after years of seeking, of meditating under a tree in complete stillness, he came to a profound discovery: that the self we try to satisfy, the one always wanting more, the one always afraid, always hungry, was never real to begin with. It was a construction, a pattern of thoughts and desires mistaken for a permanent identity. This teaching, anatta or no self, is often misunderstood. People think it means you don't exist or that your uniqueness doesn't matter. But it's not about erasing who you are. It's about realizing that who you think you are, the collection of stories, labels, memories, and roles, is not the deepest truth of your being. And once you see through that illusion, once you stop chasing something to complete you, the hunger begins to dissolve. Not because it's been filled, but because you no longer believe it defines you. In the West, we are trained from birth to build a self. We are taught to accumulate meaning through doing, achieving, and being needed. And while there is beauty in responsibility, there is also a trap. Because when the roles fade, when the children move out, when the job ends, when the spotlight dims, we often find ourselves staring into that emptiness, wondering where our worth went. But the truth is, it never left. It was simply hidden behind the masks we wore for so long. The hunger we feel isn't proof of failure. It's a doorway. It's the first knock of awakening, asking us to look deeper than we ever have before. And that hunger isn't asking for another title, another project, or another person to take care of. It's asking for presence. It's asking us to meet ourselves beyond name, beyond form, beyond doing. In one old Zen story, a student asks the master, "How do I find my true self?" The master replies, "If you want to find your true self, let go of everything that is." In that moment, the student realizes the truth was never far away. It was simply obscured by layers of identity, fear, and habit. And so it is with us. The hunger is not calling us toward more. It's calling us back to less. Not less in a way of lack, but less in the way a quiet forest holds more life than a crowded street. Less noise, more clarity. So if you feel that hunger, if you feel it rising in quiet afternoons or whispering behind your eyes as you lie in bed at night, don't panic. Don't fill it too quickly with distractions. Sit with it. Listen to it. Let it open a space inside you, because that space is not emptiness, it's spaciousness. And in that spaciousness, your true self isn't something you build, it's something you remember. Chapter 2. The Illusion of Self. There is a moment in life that arrives not with any announcement, but like a tide that slowly pulls away everything you thought made you whole. You are sitting at the kitchen table one morning, maybe watching the light pour in through the same window that's always been there, the same mug in your hands, the same creaking floor beneath your feet. And yet something is missing, not visibly, not loudly, but deeply. The kind of absence that doesn't show up in photographs or medical reports, but in the quiet in-between moments. You stir your coffee, stare out the window, and wonder, why does it feel like I'm here, but not really? You see, this is not a problem that needs solving. It's not something you can name or explain in a single sentence. It's not depression, not fatigue, not a midlife crisis or spiritual awakening. And yet it carries the shadows of all those things. What we are talking about is a spiritual hunger. A hunger not for food or love or even meaning, but for a kind of presence that no external thing can offer. A kind of wholeness that can only be remembered, not given. In Buddhism, there's a word for this feeling, dukkha. Most people translate it simply as suffering, but that's too narrow. Dukkha is the subtle dissatisfaction that threads through our ordinary lives. It is the tension between what is and what we think should be. It is the ache that hums beneath even our happiest moments, the part of us that thinks, this is nice, but it won't last. It's the gentle but relentless voice that whispers, more. There has to be more. We chase that more through careers, relationships, achievements, even spiritual practices. We meditate not to be still, but to become someone who is still. We volunteer not to give, but to become someone who gives. We even love with an eye on being loved in return. And all of this, the Buddha taught, comes from one root, grasping. Not necessarily material greed, but the deeper habit of reaching outside ourselves for something to complete us. And every time we grasp, even at something beautiful, we reinforce the belief that who we are now is not enough. I once met a woman named Eleanor. She was in her 70s, retired from a long career as a nurse. Her children were grown, successful. Her home was quiet, warm, filled with family photos and carefully folded linens. From the outside, it looked like peace. But as she told me her story, she said something I'll never forget. I spent my whole life helping others, and now I sit in this chair day after day and wonder who helps me. Not in bitterness, but in quiet confusion. I gave everything, but I don't know who I am without giving. Her identity was so fused with being useful that the stillness of retirement felt like a kind of death. She wasn't unhappy, she just felt invisible, unneeded, empty. What Eleanor was touching was the core truth the Buddha pointed to when he spoke of anatta, not self. This is perhaps the most misunderstood teaching in Buddhism. People hear it and think it means we don't exist, that we're just illusions. But that's not it at all. The teaching of not self is not about denying your existence. It's about recognizing that the self you cling to is a process, not a fixed thing. Who you think you are, mother, helper, achiever, good person, spiritual seeker, is a collection of habits, memories, emotions, and roles. It's fluid, ever-changing. And when we forget this, we suffer. Because we start to defend something that isn't stable. We try to protect an identity that was never permanent to begin with. You are not broken for feeling lost. You are simply experiencing what happens when the false ground beneath you begins to dissolve. And though it may feel like falling, it's also a kind of waking up. The truth is, The self you've worked so hard to build cannot carry you into the kind of freedom your soul is longing for. That doesn't mean you need to destroy your personality or become some blank spiritual being. It means you are invited, lovingly, gently, to loosen your grip, to hold your sense of self more lightly, to see it not as the truth but as a temporary lens. The great Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki once said, "You are perfect just as you are, and you could use a little improvement." It sounds paradoxical, but it holds a deep wisdom. Who you are in this moment, with your doubts, your regrets, your tired bones and restless heart, is not a mistake. But the peace you seek will not come from fixing or perfecting that self. It will come from seeing through it, from remembering that beneath all the roles you've played is a presence that has never left you, a stillness that has always known. I often return to a story the Buddha told about a musician. A young man asked him how to find peace in meditation. The Buddha said, "Tell me, when your lute strings are too tight, what happens?" "They snap," the man replied. "And when they are too loose, they don't play." "Exactly," the Buddha said, "and when they are tuned just right, they make beautiful music." That, the Buddha smiled, is the middle way. Not striving, not slacking, just enough effort, just enough surrender. This story, simple as it is, reveals the art of spiritual life. We cannot force awakening, but we must also not abandon ourselves. We walk the path like tuning an instrument, listening, adjusting, staying curious. When you feel empty, don't tighten the strings, don't rush to fix, but also don't give up and drift. Tune yourself toward presence, toward gentle inquiry, toward stillness that listens instead of reaching. I know that may sound vague, so let me offer something more tangible. When you wake up tomorrow, instead of asking, "What do I need to do today?" try asking, "What is true right now?" That's it. One question, breathe into it. Let your mind settle and notice what arises. Maybe it's discomfort, maybe it's gratitude, maybe it's nothing at all. But in that noticing, something beautiful happens. You stop performing and you start being. You stop grasping and you start meeting life as it is. This is the quiet revolution the Buddha began under the Bodhi tree, not to become something more, but to recognize what has always been here. Your awareness, your breath, your tender, trembling aliveness. You don't need to fix your emptiness. You need to listen to it, because it might be the very doorway through which a deeper self, not the one you've built, but the one that's been waiting, finally steps forward. And so, as we continue this journey together, I invite you to stay close to that quiet space inside you, not with fear, not with judgment, but with kindness. Because if you lean into the silence long enough, you may just hear the voice that was always meant to guide you, not shouting, not commanding, but whispering. You are here, you are enough, you are free. Chapter 3: The Shapes of Emptiness. Victor is 71 years old now. He sits by the same window every morning, the one that once framed sunrises like promises. The glass is clean. The trees outside are quiet. Nothing is wrong. Nothing is broken. And yet something inside him has faded, not like a fire put out, but like a photograph left too long in sunlight, its colors dulled by time. Victor used to be someone, a professor, a father, a partner, a mentor. His days used to be defined by the ringing of bells, the clatter of chalk on board, the hum of questions from students who looked to him as if he held the map to the universe. He used to be needed. He used to be known. And now, he watches the light shift across the floorboards and wonders if he was ever really there at all. Not because he's forgotten, but because in the stillness of retirement, when no one asks for anything, when the inbox stays empty, and the calendar no longer rules his life, he has discovered a different kind of silence. One that is not peaceful but hollow. He once said, "I spent 40 years climbing a ladder, and now I'm at the top of the wrong wall." And those words have stayed with me, because they are not just Victor S. They belong to so many of us who did what we were told, followed the rules, built the life, only to arrive at the summit and find the view barren. This is the emptiness of misalignment, of living a life that may have made sense on paper, but left the soul behind. It's a quiet ache, this kind of emptiness. Not because it hurts, but because it no longer stirs. It doesn't cry out. It doesn't demand. It just lingers, like a question we're afraid to answer. But there are other forms of emptiness too, not born from the latter, but from the performance. The kind of emptiness that comes from always being strong, always being composed, always having the right answer, the calm voice, the steady hands. This is the emptiness of never letting yourself fall apart, of wearing armor for so long that you forget what skin feels like. And one day, when the world finally quiets and no one is watching, you realize you do know who you are beneath the mask. You look in the mirror and see a face you recognize, but a person you can't quite name. Because strength, when performed too long, becomes a prison. And prisons, no matter how safe, cannot nourish the soul. There is the emptiness of trauma, a different silence altogether. One that doesn't come from age or performance, but from moments long buried. The kind of emptiness left behind by things that happened too fast, too cruel, too young. These wounds don't scream, they whisper, they freeze time inside us. We grow older, but parts of us stay stuck. A 5-year-old still flinching, a teenager still aching, an adult still waiting for permission to cry. Trauma's emptiness is a locked room in the house of our being. And even when life is good, when love surrounds us, that room remains cold, untouched, forgotten, until something, a smell, a word, a memory, cracks the door open and we feel again, for a moment, the shiver of our own past. And then there is the emptiness that comes with aging itself. The kind that doesn't come from pain or fear, but from unfamiliarity. You look in the mirror and don't quite recognize the hands that touch your face, the hair that's changed, the body that no longer rushes. But more than that, it's the way the world stops seeing you. The way your usefulness, your contribution, your voice, once vital, begins to fade into background noise. You sit in a room with younger people and suddenly realize you are invisible, not out of cruelty, but out of ignorance. They do not see you because they do not yet know that time will take them here too. And this invisibility brings with it a strange kind of emptiness, not because you are less, but because you are no longer required to be more. Each of these emptinesses has its own shape, its own weight, its own voice. But if you listen carefully, they are all asking the same question. Are you willing to meet yourself without armor? Are you willing to stop performing, to stop defining, to stop editing your truth so that others might find it easier to digest? Because beneath all the layers, the roles, the stories, the traumas, the expectations, there is something untouched, something soft, something sacred. And it is not a self in the way we usually think. It is not an identity or a brand or a resume. It is presence. It is awareness itself. It is the part of you that was never born and will never die. And when we turn toward that, not with theory but with tenderness, something in us begins to soften. The hunger begins to lose its edge. The emptiness begins to shimmer not as lack but as space. And in that space, there is room to breathe, room to rest, room to remember. The Zen masters used to say, don't seek the truth, only cease to cherish opinions. Because the opinions we cherish most are often the ones we hold about ourselves, who we think we are, what we think we need, the story we believe must be true or else everything falls apart. But what if we let those go? What if we stop clinging to the idea that we must be someone specific, do something specific, feel something specific? What if we just allow ourselves to be, moment by moment, breath by breath? What if, like the sky, We let all weather pass through us without losing our vastness. Victor is still learning. He sits by the window not with despair now, but with curiosity. He watches the light not to mark time, but to witness it. He no longer asks, "What's next?" so much as, "What's here?" And in that question, he has begun to discover a kind of peace that success never offered, the peace of presence without purpose, of being without proving, of existing without the pressure to justify his existence. And maybe that's what all these shapes of emptiness are pointing us toward, not a new version of ourselves, but the end of needing one. Not another ladder to climb, but a ground to rest upon. A place where we can finally stop reaching and start receiving, where we can finally hear the quiet voice that has been waiting inside us all along, whispering not what to become, but simply this: you are already enough. Chapter 4: The Wisdom of Emptiness. In the West, when people hear the word emptiness, their minds often go to loneliness, despair, or depression, as if emptiness is a failure, a lack, a void that must be filled. But in the language of the Buddha, the word was different. It was sunyata, and this word did not mean absence in the way we think of it. It meant spaciousness, freedom, the natural state of all things when they are not clung to, not solidified, not trapped in a fixed idea. It is the opposite of despair. It is liberation. Because in truth, what we call reality is not made of solid, unchanging objects. It is made of processes, movements, conditions, like weather patterns more than statues. And when the Buddha said, "Form is emptiness," emptiness is form, he wasn't offering a riddle. He was revealing the most liberating truth of all, that nothing has a permanent, unchanging essence. Not your body, not your personality, not your suffering, not even your name. Everything that arises in this life, every emotion, every identity, every circumstance is dependently originated. Meaning, it comes into being because of a web of causes and conditions, and it fades when those conditions change. Just like clouds forming in the sky or waves rising from the ocean, so too are you, a momentary constellation of breath, thought, memory, sensation, ancestry, culture, biology, and choice. And once you see this clearly, truly see it not just in thought but in your bones, a great pressure lifts. Because suddenly, you realize you do not have to hold so tightly to being anything. You don't have to be the perfect parent, the successful retiree, the endlessly wise person, or even the one who has it all figured out. You don't have to fix yourself before you can rest. You don't have to finish some invisible checklist before you are allowed to feel whole. You can let it go, all of it, and return to the simple truth beneath all the doing, that you are here, alive, awake, breathing. And in this presence, there is nothing missing. One afternoon, I was walking with a friend through a quiet garden at a retreat center. The sky was soft, pale blue, and the wind moved the leaves just enough to make the world feel like it was exhaling. We stopped near a lotus pond, where a single pink flower had just bloomed from the water. She turned to me and said, "You know what I'm realizing? I've spent so much of my life trying to be someone, trying to be impressive, trying to get it right. But I think I was meant to just be the space, not the story, just the stillness." And I knew exactly what she meant. Because when you stop trying to be someone, to prove something, to hold something, to live up to something, you finally start to feel what's actually true. You begin to rest, not because your life is perfect, but because you're no longer at war with it. You begin to soften, not because your problems are gone, but because you're not clinging to the idea that you should be different, or that your life should be somewhere else. This is the wisdom of emptiness. It does not ask you to become hollow. It asks you to become open, not void but vast, not detached but unbound. Because when you are no longer holding onto a fixed self, You can finally respond to life with presence instead of protection. You can meet each moment without dragging the past into it. You can grieve without being consumed. You can love without being afraid of loss. You can change without fearing that something essential will disappear. Because you begin to see that there is no essential thing to protect, only a living, breathing stream of experience that you get to participate in. The old masters would often use the image of a mirror. A mirror, they said, reflects everything but holds nothing. It does not cling to the images that appear. It does not judge what it shows. And yet, it is always present, always clear. In the same way, the awakened heart reflects the world without being entangled by it. It feels everything, joy, pain, hope, sorrow, but it does not freeze around any of it. It is free because it is empty of attachment, not empty of care. And perhaps that is the most beautiful paradox of all, that when you realize you are not a fixed self, not a solid identity, but a fluid, changing process, you don't become less human. You become more alive. You become more compassionate because you understand how fragile everything is. You become more forgiving because you no longer see people as just their worst moment or most painful wound. You become more peaceful, not because you've solved every problem, but because you've stopped believing you are your problems. In the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, he often spoke about interbeing, the idea that we are not separate selves, but deeply interconnected waves on the ocean of life. He would hold up a piece of paper and say, "In this sheet of paper I see the cloud, I see the rain, I see the tree, I see the logger, I see the sunlight. Without these, the paper could not exist." And in the same way, if you look deeply into your own life, you will see that you are not just your story. You are your grandmother's laughter, your father's struggle, the song that held you during your hardest nights, the stranger who once smiled at you on a rainy morning. You are this entire universe moving through one body for a little while. How could such a thing ever be empty? So when the silence comes, not the peaceful silence, but the one that aches, let it speak. Let it teach. Let it reveal the walls you've built around your own heart, the identities you've worn too long, the expectations you've mistaken for truth. And then let it all fall. Let it fall like autumn leaves, not with resistance but with trust. Because the tree is not dying when the leaves fall. It is preparing for rest, for rebirth, for the next season. And maybe you too are not lost, not broken, not behind. Maybe you are simply shedding what is no longer needed. Maybe you are becoming spacious enough for something more honest to enter. Maybe, just maybe, you are coming home. Chapter 5. How to Listen to Emptiness. We spend much of our lives trying to escape the feeling of emptiness. We run from it with noise, with tasks, with people, with distraction, hoping that if we just stay busy enough, we won't have to hear it whisper our name. But what if emptiness isn't a threat but a doorway? What if instead of fleeing the void, we turn toward it? Not as something broken to be fixed, but as something sacred to be witnessed. Because that ache you carry, that strange hollowness, it doesn't come to hurt you. It comes to call you back to the parts of yourself that you've left behind. So begin there. Begin with sitting. Sit with the hollow places. Not in judgment, not in fear, but in quiet companionship. Close your eyes. Let the breath find its own rhythm. You don't have to perform calmness. You don't have to do it right. You are not meditating to become better. You are meditating to become honest. Breathe into the emptiness the way you might breathe into a quiet room after everyone's gone home. You don't rush it. You let it speak. And then ask gently, with the tenderness of a friend who's finally ready to listen, what part of me has been unheard? Not what's wrong with me, not how do I fix this, but simply what in me has been waiting to be seen. You may feel tears, you may feel nothing, you may feel warmth, or a kind of ache that has no name. All of it is welcome. All of it is truth, because emptiness is not the absence of feeling. It is the place where unspoken feelings live. And when you sit with it, you are not collapsing, you are returning. There is also a mirror ritual I share with those who feel especially lost. It's simple, but it can change everything. You stand before a mirror, not to critique yourself, not to evaluate how time has changed your face, but to meet your reflection like an old friend, someone you forgot you loved. Look at yourself with kind eyes, not soft in pity, but soft in reverence. See the lines that have formed not from age, but from courage. See the eyes that still hold light, even if dimmed by years of giving. And then say aloud, even if your voice shakes, even if your chest feels tight, say, I see the parts of me that feel empty, and I will no longer abandon them. Because this is the greatest vow you can make to yourself, to stay with the parts of you that felt invisible, to stay with the pieces of you that were always told to be strong, to move on, to smile anyway, to stay with your inner child, your inner elder, your silent self, and simply say, I will not leave you again. And after that, return to the breath, just breath. No story, no title, no performance. Let breath be your only identity. You are not someone's idea of you. You are not your past. You are not your future. You are not even your thoughts. You are the witness to it all, the one who sits, who sees, who breathes. In the words of Thich Nhat letter 1ea5t, H letter 1ea1nh, you are not an observer. You are a participant in the unfolding of the present moment. You are not standing outside your life. You are living it even now, even here, even in the quiet where nothing seems certain. And that moment, this moment, is enough. No applause, no achievements, just the sacred simplicity of being alive, aware, and willing to be present. Listening to emptiness is not about solving a mystery. It's about remembering a truth. The truth that what you are, what you have always been, is not defined by how useful you are to others, not measured by how productive you've been, not diminished by time or age or the soft fog of not knowing what's next. Listening to emptiness is the art of no longer trying to outrun yourself. It is the act of coming home to a body, a breath, a moment, and saying, this is enough for now. And when you practice this often, something begins to shift. The emptiness softens, not because you've filled it, but because you've befriended it. It no longer feels like a wound, but a womb, a sacred space where new life can grow. From this space, your intuition rises. From this stillness, your clarity unfolds. From this silence, your truest self, the one beneath all masks, begins to speak. So don't fear the hollow places. They are not signs that you are broken. They are signs that something deeper is ready to be known. Sit with them, bless them, and let them bless you in return. Chapter 6. Stories of Returning. Grace didn't plan to change her life. She didn't have a list of goals or a therapist guiding her toward reinvention. She simply walked into her garden one morning and noticed how the early light shimmered on the dew-covered leaves. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she didn't rush back inside. She knelt down near the soil, her knees aching slightly from age but her breath slowing, softening. With trembling fingers, she touched the earth. Not to cultivate it, not to harvest anything in particular, but to remember what it felt like to be connected. She started gardening not for fruit, not even for flowers, but for the sensation of touch, for the honest contact between her hands and something living. She once said, each seed I plant feels like a whisper, like the earth reminding me that life still flows even when I can't feel it moving inside me. There was no dramatic moment, no applause, just a quiet revolution. The kind that doesn't need a name. Victor had always been the kind of man who demanded answers from life. A scholar, a mentor, someone whose voice had weight in lecture halls and academic panels. But retirement pulled the scaffolding out from under him. The praise stopped. The phone quieted. The mirror began to show a man unmoored. For a long time he drifted. Then one afternoon, without much thought, he bought a set of cheap acrylic paints and a few blank canvases. He didn't know why. He had no vision in mind. He just started painting not landscapes or portraits, but swirls, lines, circles that made no immediate sense. Abstract shapes that didn't strive to impress. One day, while looking at a canvas full of color and confusion, he smiled and said, "I'm finally making art for the boy I once was, not for anyone else." In that moment, he didn't need to be a professor. He didn't need to be anything. He was simply a man rediscovering what it meant to create without proving, to express without fear. That was his return not to the past, but to a self that had waited patiently beneath the rolls. Linda is 74. Her hair is silver now and her body no longer moves the way it once did. But every morning without fail, she rises before the sun, lights a small candle and sits by her window. Sometimes she prays. Sometimes she breathes. Sometimes she says nothing at all. But there is one phrase she always speaks aloud, like a mantra whispered to the dawn. "I trust this moment. I release the rest." She says it not as a magical spell to fix her life, but as a sacred surrender, a quiet acknowledgement that peace doesn't come from control, but from release. And in that gentle flame, in the hush before the world stirs, she finds her sanctuary. None of these stories are grand transformations. They don't belong on talk shows or self-help bestsellers, but they are revolutions nonetheless. Soft, unassuming revolutions where emptiness stopped being a curse and became a doorway, where silence stopped being a punishment and became prayer. These are the stories of returning, not to who they used to be, but to the parts of themselves that had long been silenced by usefulness, noise, and expectation. Because the truth is, healing doesn't always arrive in thunderclaps. Sometimes, it arrives in the quiet decision to sit still when everything tells you to move. Sometimes it shows up in a paintbrush dipped in uncertainty. Sometimes it grows slowly, seed by seed, in a patch of earth that reminds you how to feel again. These returns are not always visible from the outside. They don't earn medals or congratulations, but they change everything. And perhaps the greatest act of courage is not to change who we are, but to come home to what was never broken. To sit with the silence not as an enemy, but as an old friend who's waited long enough. These stories, then, are not advice. They are invitations. Each one gently says, "You too can return. You too can choose tenderness over performance. You too can make space where once there was only ache." And if you are still wondering if it's too late, let these voices remind you. It is never too late to remember yourself. Never too late to plant a seed, light a candle, or let your hands create for the sake of joy alone. Never too late to say, "I trust this moment, I release the rest." Even now, especially now. Chapter 7. Embracing the Great Unknowing. Most of what we fear isn't pain, it isn't even loss. It's not knowing. It's the silence before a diagnosis, the moment after the phone stops ringing, the space between a question and its answer. Our deepest anxiety often lives not in what is happening, but in what might. We ache for certainty like thirsty wanderers in a desert, reaching for the mirage of just knowing. Knowing what will come next, knowing how things will turn out, knowing who we are, how we'll be remembered, how our stories will end. But life doesn't deal in guarantees, and the more we try to hold it still, the more it slips between our fingers. Buddhist wisdom, however, offers something radically different. It doesn't promise to fix uncertainty. It asks us to bow to it, to recognize the unknown not as a threat but as a teacher, A phrase from the ancient texts whispers, "The unknown is not your enemy. It is simply the part of life that has not yet arrived." What would happen if you stopped resisting that? If you softened around the need to always understand, always define, always plan? What if the space you're afraid of, that open, undefined, mysterious stretch ahead, is not a void but a womb? Not the end of your story, but the gentle pause before a deeper chapter begins. To embrace the unknown is not to be passive. It is to be present. It is to breathe in this very moment without needing to know what comes next. It is to trust that you can meet whatever life brings, not because you're certain, but because you are here, alive, awake, with breath still moving through you. And maybe that's enough. Let go of needing answers. Let go of needing to matter in a certain way. Let go of needing to always be someone. You don't have to be the wise one, the strong one, the useful one. You don't have to carry the world on your back. You can simply be. Let yourself be breathed by the universe, the same way the trees are, the same way the tides rise and fall, the same way stars are born not with explanation but with wonder. There's a teaching from the Zen tradition that says, "You are not the clouds, you are the sky. Clouds come and go, storms may rage, but the sky remains spacious and still, unthreatened by whatever passes through it. And the sky doesn't fear the wind. It doesn't argue with the rain, it opens. Always. To live like the sky is to live undefended. It's to welcome joy without clinging and sorrow without resistance. It's to let the seasons change inside you and to know, truly know, that nothing you lose was ever truly yours. Not your youth, not your name, not even your body. All of it is on loan. All of it returns to the earth in time. But what remains, what can never be taken, is your openness, your awareness, your ability to love without needing a reason, your quiet, enduring presence in this unfolding moment. And maybe the most sacred thing you can do in the face of all that is uncertain is to say, yes, even now, even here. Not because it's easy, but because it's honest. This is what it means to embrace the great unknowing. It's not about figuring things out. It's about letting go of the illusion that you ever could. It's about becoming soft in a world that taught you to be hard, becoming still in a life that demanded motion, becoming free in a body that changes every day. And when you do that, when you stop resisting the wind, you don't disappear. You expand. You become vast like the sky. And in that vastness, everything is allowed, every feeling, every breath, every not knowing. So if you are standing at the edge of your life, uncertain of what comes next, breathe. Let yourself not know. Let yourself be held by something bigger than understanding, because even in your not knowing, you are not alone. Chapter 8. The Healing of No Self. You were never meant to be permanent. That's the truth we avoid, the one tucked behind every wrinkle, every goodbye, every season that shifts without our permission. You are not built to be fixed, finished, or final. You are not a statue to be admired or preserved. You are a wave, rising and falling with the tide of your own becoming. You are a sunrise, always beginning, never quite complete. You are a changing sky, at times stormy, at times still, but never, not once, the same sky twice. And yet, for so much of our lives, we fight this. We grip onto definitions of self as if they were lifelines. We wear names, roles, titles like armor, believing they will hold us together when life inevitably begins to unravel. But the unraveling is not the problem. The clinging is. The tighter we try to hold onto who we were, the more we suffer. Because who we were was never ours to keep. That version of you, the one who once was busy, needed, younger, louder, useful, she was beautiful. But she was also temporary, and that's not a flaw, that's the design. Buddhism calls this insight anatta, the truth of no fixed self. Not that you don't exist, but that you are not a thing. You are a process, a happening, a moment-by-moment unfolding of breath, memory, thought, sensation, kindness, pain, silence. You are not a person frozen in identity. You are being in motion. And within this constant flow, there is great tenderness. Because what begins to fall away isn't your worth. It's the illusion that you ever had to prove it. There is a healing that arrives quietly when you stop chasing fullness and instead begin to rest in the truth of your own spaciousness. You start to realize that your emptiness was never a sign of failure. It was an invitation, an opening, a doorway to freedom. Because when you stop trying to be full of achievements, full of validation, full of certainty, you finally become free. Free to exist as you are without needing a label. Free to feel what you feel without editing your soul to please someone else. Free to simply be alive, breathing, present, without the pressure to perform some version of you that the world expects. And in that freedom, something remarkable happens. You start to soften. You begin to listen. You return to yourself not as a name or a job or a mother or a role, but as a presence, quiet, compassionate, open. You begin to move through your day with less demand and more reverence. You notice the warmth of tea in your hands, the sound of leaves brushing the sidewalk, the tender way your heart still beats after everything. And you begin to understand that home was never a place or a person or a purpose. Home was always the space within you that allows life to be what it is, without resistance, without fear, without needing to control the outcome. It's the spaciousness that holds joy and sorrow without clinging to either. It's the breath you return to when nothing makes sense. It's the stillness behind your thoughts, the silence that doesn't demand to be filled. This is the gift of no self. Not emptiness as void, but emptiness as openness, as healing, as peace. So if you have ever felt like you're disappearing, if you have ever looked in the mirror and not recognized the person staring back, if you've ever wondered where the old version of you went, take heart. She didn't vanish. She evolved. She surrendered her sharp edges. She shed the stories that no longer held truth. She opened herself to a different kind of beauty, one that is not built on permanence but on presence. And in doing so, she didn't become less. She became more honest, more whole, more free. So let yourself be the wave. Let yourself rise and fall. Let yourself crash and retreat and rise again. Let yourself be the sky. Let your clouds come and go. Let the sun break through when it's ready. You are not what you do. You are not what you've lost. You are not the version of you others remember. You are this breath, this presence, this moment awake, aware, and alive. And that is more than enough. So pause just for a moment. Let the world continue without you for a breath or two. Let the ticking clock soften. Let the demands fall away. And close your eyes not to escape but to return. Return to something you've always carried but perhaps forgot to notice. The vastness within you. That quiet, spacious field beneath all the noise, all the names, all the proving. That sacred silence that isn't empty, it's generous. It holds everything you've ever felt and everything you've yet to feel. It waits patiently, without demand, for the moment you are ready to simply come home. You are not empty. You are spacious. And in that space, the divine has always lived, not far away, not in some distant heaven, but here, within your breath, within your awareness, within the stillness that remains after the stories have faded. You are not broken. You are becoming. Like the sky becoming morning, like the seed becoming bloom, like the heart once closed learning to open again. And it is never too late, not for joy, not for peace, not for grace, not to meet yourself again with the kind of softness the world never taught you but your soul always needed. You do not need to be more. You do not need to be fixed. You only need to be here, with breath, with awareness, with no story to carry and no role to perform. Just presence, just this moment, just you, vast, luminous, and enough. If this video touched something true in you, stay with us. This space, this quiet corner of the world is here for you. Subscribe to Quiet Wisdom. Let this be a sanctuary you return to whenever the noise gets too loud. And in the comments, share with us. What is your emptiness trying to tell you today? You may be surprised by what your heart whispers back. And until we meet again, walk slowly. Breathe gently. Let go often. And trust that the healing has already begun, even if it's silent. Especially if it's silent. Because the path back to yourself is not loud or grand. It's tender, patient, sacred. Namaste.